What was your education like? What was that sort of initial career path to get into that like?
Like many people in this industry, because it's so new, because it's continuously evolving, I actually didn't have any kind of cybersecurity experience coming into work. I actually took an accounting degree. So many people think I have to be a programmer or I have to be a network engineer to get into cybersecurity, and that is 100% not true.
Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Cybersecurity Stand Up. I am your host, Bronwyn Hudson, and today I'm joined by Aaron Kraus. I'm super excited to have Aaron here today because he's an author of multiple books. Super excited to talk about what you've written and how you got to this incredible place of authorship. Aaron, can you tell the people a little bit about yourself and what you do now and how you got to where you are?
Yeah, well, thank you, Bronwyn. Great to be here and great to join you. My name is Aaron Kraus, cybersecurity expert. Been working in this field now coming up on 20 years. To your point about writing, that actually stemmed from teaching on the side. I found that I had an ability to kind of take complex topics, break them down into smaller, more digestible pieces, build a narrative that tied those things together, and just eventually turn that into writing as well. I got started by doing some technical editing work, filled in to write a page here or flesh out a section there where the original authors maybe had not done quite as good a job before we actually went to print, and then was eventually invited to write. Got 3 books out, 2 current editions, one the CISSP CBK, and then also the CCSP CBK, both of which are part of the recently rebranded ISC2. I'm still trying to get a handle on that one, but part of ISC2 certification schemes.
Really exciting because I actually have a background in sort of writing myself. And one of the things that I'm most excited about, sort of theoretically, but in practice too, is taking complex topics and making them more accessible to a broader audience. Can you tell us, like, what was your education like? What was that sort of initial career path to get into that like?
Like many people in this industry, because it's so new, because it's continuously evolving, I actually didn't have any kind of cybersecurity experience coming into work. I actually took an accounting degree, never even balanced my own checkbook, so really putting that to good use. But what was critical in that was it was right after all of the big corporate scandals of kind of the early 2000s. So auditing and compliance were a huge part of the accounting program. Things like how do we make sure that we don't have another Enron type of scandal. The good news is that's a transferable set of skills. So you can perform an audit just using a different framework. You still use the same skills. You gather information, you compare it to a documented standard, you make some judgment calls about what am I looking at? Does it meet the requirements that were set forth? Obviously, for accounting here in the US, that's going to be Sarbanes-Oxley. For cybersecurity, my initial work was actually supporting US federal government clients, so I was comparing to the NIST 853 standards as part of FISMA compliance. So really just took that and kind of pivoted. Technically, I'm trying to figure out if I want to be a CPA when I grow up, but like I said, it's been almost 20 years, so I think that one's officially off the table, and it would probably involve a lot more studying. But yeah, that's been the through line to my career. And because I was making that sort of lateral shift, that was really where I approached a lot of these concepts from a starting point. I had to figure out
Yeah.
how to learn and level up my own skills. Didn't get it in academics, had to approach these really large, complex topics, learn all of that stuff myself. So I really just applied the same skills, or I apply the same skills that I used myself, taking these large topics like access control, breaking it down into those more manageable pieces, learning that, and then putting it all together to figure out when I'm working as a virtual CISO, how do I build an access control program for an organization? Similarly, auditing it, you're looking at it just from the other perspective. What are the pieces? How do they fit together? Does it actually meet the objective that the compliance framework sets?
What you said one question ago, that you also got into this via teaching on the side. Can you tell me about that?
Yeah, I've been working with Learning Tree International for a little over 15 years now.
Wow.
Started off doing some training in their SharePoint curriculum. I was using it very heavily as an audit support tool, kind of building out basically audit portals that we could use to manage the flow of documents required for an audit. Attended a class, fell into conversation with an instructor. He's like, hey, we actually need more instructors for this class. Once you finish it, would you be interested? So joined there, and then I've worked my way through a couple of different topics. But as my security career progressed, I continued working with Learning Tree, and most recently I've been teaching the CISSP and CCSP exam prep courses. Again, similar skill set as I learned new topics. Took that approach of breaking it down into component pieces and figuring out how they all fit together. It's basically the same set of skills that you use when you're teaching something that you've mastered, and I've continued to do that. I get a lot of satisfaction out of it, but I'm also exhausted at the end of every week teaching. It's grueling, but I love the fact that I get people with all different backgrounds, network engineers who are learning things about like policies or security training as part of their CISSP exam studying, and then vice versa, people like me who maybe come from more non-technical backgrounds, helping
Yeah.
them get an understanding of like the deep telecommunications and network security topics that they might be unfamiliar with. It's like I said, it's exhausting, but it's so gratifying to see that little light bulb go off as people are like, oh, I finally get that. I understand how all of the layers of the OSI model fit together when we're talking about security, how we secure data at each of those layers.
Love that. Yeah. I like what you say too. It's interesting that your students are people of different backgrounds. And one of the things I've really been diving into recently is this potentially false dichotomy between non-technical and technical sort of like audiences. And especially when you're approaching, a technically very tough field, really, cyber in general, with also a very like young history. Would you say from the perspective of a teacher that there are particular advantages or disadvantages to being either like already quite technical or quite non-technical? What's the perspective there?
This actually bleeds over interestingly into the work that I do as a virtual CISO in consulting as well, because I don't think it's necessarily so much the audience in that situation. It's more of the background that people bring. And obviously, all businesses have business decision makers. Those folks tend to be less technical, but obviously, the field of cybersecurity is very technical. So I find there's often a gap in understanding or approach that those business leaders take simply because you go into a cybersecurity convention and it's like walking into a Star Trek convention. It's all in universe. It's you might as well give the presentation in Klingon. The CEO and CFO are going to just as much. It's we can talk about MAC addresses and IPs and all this stuff, but if we can't contextualize it for that audience, it's really tough for them to understand, really tough for them to put the appropriate resources in place.
Yeah.
So in teaching, I've kind of noticed that it's a matter of figuring out, okay, what's the mental model an individual student has? Part of that's going to be their learning style. Part of it will also be their background. Did they come from a network engineering background or an auditing background? And then how do I kind of help them understand the translation of their experience into this new topic? And like I said, it's the exact same thing, taking your network security engineers and translating all of the important work that they do into metrics that the business decision makers can understand. And that
Gotcha.
gap in understanding oftentimes leads to security risks that go unmitigated.
Well, it's so fascinating because I feel like one thing that I've heard you say is this idea of taking the big concept and breaking it down into smaller ones. Can you give us like an example of that, or what is that like to do on a practical level?
I'll start first by saying I hate the term dumb it down. That implies that your audience is dumb. So when I'm approaching things, I look at like a really big concept. Let's do access control. That's a perfect example. When we look at security controls, I like to think of them on kind of a timeline. We talk a lot about risk management. The risk is something happening. When we're building controls, we have to do things before a risk happens. So we have those kind of preventative controls. And then after a risk happens, if all else fails, we have those reactive controls. So when we talk about an access control program, well, what's the first thing that we need to do? We need to make sure that we have the right people in the office or in a particular building or who have access to a system. So we do all of this preventative work. We do things like background investigations. We do things like working with the people team to make sure that we're adequately documenting job descriptions so we're attracting the right candidates, people who have the right knowledge for whatever we're trying to do. We put password policies in place. We do all that kind of stuff. And then, of course, all of the security monitoring that we do to see if one of those people goes rogue, if somebody's account has become compromised. We have things like our SIM or our security alerting systems. We log and monitor system or building access. Access control is a huge area. It's an entire domain in the CISSP body of knowledge. That's a great example of like, how do I design an access control program? Well, break it down into those pieces. I like to, like I said, look at that timeline. What do we do really, really early on? Background investigations. What do we do when we talk about provisioning individual access? What do we have like an access request process? And then what do we do for that continuous monitoring? What do we look for if something were to go wrong? That's not dumbing down the concept of access control, that's breaking it down into component parts. At the end of it is say, okay, let's zoom back out and say across the entire timeline, and we typically look at an access provisioning lifecycle or an access control lifecycle where we have provisioning, reviews, and deprovisioning. That's how you kind of tie everything back together with all those individual pieces that you've explored.
So fascinating. When you're writing these ISC2 books, Like, what is that process like? Because you kind of have to like break it all down to be able to teach people, but then also kind of like what wrap it all back up again for these books, right?
That one, luckily, I have a little bit of a cheat sheet because the all of the exams have their associated content outlines. The exam preps that ISC2 publishes is a high level outline of all of the critical topics, but it doesn't go into any details. It's just high level, access control is broken down into the access control lifecycle, just-in-time access provisioning, one or two other things, and then it's up to us as the authors to flesh that out, to expand on the details, to figure out how does this thing tie into something else. One of the really interesting, I'd say, challenges that we faced, because I've been working on the ISC2 book since about 2015-ish.
Oh, wow.
They used to have a lot of different authors. You had a lot of different kind of voices or narrative styles, and a lot of the topics that we cover are really fundamental. Risk management underpins all of the work that we do as security professionals. It's a whole domain that was written by one author, but then we refer back to those concepts in other domains. So it was really tough. Back in the early days, we had so many authors, it was really tough to kind of create a coherent narrative voice across all of them to make sure a new person who was approaching the field understood how this concept that we explored in chapter one, the risk management domain, tied into software development security, domain 8 that we got to at the very end of the book. I think one of the most interesting perspectives that I got was just going through and actually working with a non-technical person
Oh, yeah.
who was
Okay.
a style editor. She looked over the CISSP book and said, okay, you used this particular term, but it seems to have three different meanings. IP is a great example. When we do legal risk and compliance, that's intellectual property, has a totally different meaning when we talk about network security. Seeing it from that perspective really helped me to step back and be like, okay, how does this tie together? Do we say, yes, same acronym, totally different ideas? Do we try to tie them together in some way? That was something that, being kind of in the universe myself, I just wasn't even able to see until somebody from totally outside was like, hey, all these things don't make sense. Help me figure it out. And then figuring out how to explain that was a great kind of check on my own oversight of like, oh, I know what this topic is. I don't need to explain it in more detail.
That's so awesome because it's also like a mark of a really good editor is someone who's able to bring that perspective to you, ask you these specific questions, help you identify what actually is worth prioritizing or explaining, and then allow you to come back for these kind of edits and explain it back to someone. That's good stuff right there. I also want to ask you about. So I feel like the cybersecurity industry is saying that you've been in this space for 20 years. Very impressive, right? So what was it like when you were starting? Like, what's the history of it for you?
It's interesting to think how much has changed. 2015, 2016, I called it a disruptive moment of realizing everything that I'd done in the first part of my career no longer really made any sense. When I started, we were still doing three-tiered web application architecture where you had your web server sitting out in the DMZ, you had business logic sitting inside a network, and then you had your database layer as well. So you had your basically three tiers that served a web application. We still had that viewpoint of build a secure moat around everything and then just trust all of the resources internally. Obviously, that's been completely upended
Totally.
with the move to zero trust network architecture and just zero trust models in general. I think another big change as well as part of that is we've now decomposed the three-tiered web application. I haven't worked, I think, in about 5 or 6 years in an organization that truly has servers. Everything is serverless, everything is microservices, everything now goes through an API. So that was a huge shift. I was like, wait, I'm thinking, where do I install a security agent? Where do I deploy my host-based intrusion detection? Where do I run, my anti-malware software as it was known at the time? Now, of course, it's an EDR agent. I was like, oh, I don't actually have any servers to install this on anymore. Where am I supposed to get all the security monitoring data that I need to figure out if my controls are still working? So
Totally.
kind of about 2016 when microservices was becoming all the rage, I had that moment of like, oh, all of that knowledge is no longer relevant. It's no longer accurate. This has completely changed and shifted, and I need to figure out what to do. So now, of course, we've moved to things like API security, largely driven, I think, by mobile applications as well, where tiers of the application are something that a user's running either in a browser or on a mobile device. And then we have data and business logic splayed across different cloud environments, all of those microservices that we're running, and all of the interaction happens through API calls. So, okay, I
Yeah.
need to shift my security monitoring now. It goes into an API gateway. Is this request appropriate? Have I implemented my access control, not logging in at the front door of the application, but every single API request that comes through?
Yep.
I don't know what I want to be when I grow up, so this kind of rapid change really is exciting for me because it keeps me on my toes, keeps the challenges coming.
I mean, that's exactly what my question was going to be. It's like when these disruptive moments happen, whether it's in your career or like in the just the tech in general, do you have any tips for the audience in terms of how to approach that? Like how to not get scared, how to not immediately like fear for your job, how to stay current, like any advice there?
Don't get distracted too much by shiny objects. Back in 2019, I remember thinking, if we were to play a drinking game at the RSA conference and just go down one of the aisles, every time you saw AI, ML in marketing materials, I don't think you would have made it down more than one aisle before you were face down. It was everywhere. Obviously, COVID delayed things a little bit, but now we're finally seeing ChatGPT this year. So that was like, it was all the rage. It was a lot of people were chasing it. 4 years later, 2023, we finally have legitimate tools based on that. I've found a slightly cautious approach, be aware of those things, stay on top of what's happening, attend those industry conferences, keep an eye on new and emerging topics, but don't necessarily chase all of them. Figure out, okay, does this directly impact the work I'm doing? More importantly, make sure if you do still have things that are more legacy in your industry, make sure that you're keeping an eye on that. Don't just always chase that shiny object, but kind of keep an eye on it.
That's a fascinating and great opportunity for like a segue on this one too. Like as an author, what do you think about ChatGPT? What do you think about, Gen AI?
Luckily, it's not my main source of income, so writing is still something that I'm not too worried about. I did actually
Gotcha.
use ChatGPT earlier this year to respond. It was a free-form security questionnaire, and I just gave it as a prompt. What does a good security program look like for a fintech startup? I was doing consulting work. Other than the verb tenses, it said a good security program should have this. I went in and changed that to our security program does have this, this, and this. And I obviously
Awesome.
popped in the company name. It took at least a day of work off my plate. I think the cybersecurity skills shortage is a little bit overhyped. There's definitely a gap in the market. I don't think the numbers that get bandied around are necessarily accurate, but what I'm really excited about is generative AI, things like ChatGPT, freeing up that low level drudgery and allowing me to focus on more important things. I don't need to answer a security questionnaire that I've already filled out 100 ways before, but this question is worded slightly differently. I need to be figuring out, okay, I have people logging in from all over the world and I need to figure out if that's legit or not. Answering a security questionnaire, not a high value activity. ChatGPT, take care of that. I'm going to focus on the meteor problem.
I always feel encouraged to hear takes on generative AI. I want to also ask you, so talking about like, logins from all over the world, it's a great example of problems that we're currently facing in the industry. How do we actually identify people? And, I'm sure you know so much about all the backbones of these kind of processes. So, but right now in 2023, with all the information that you have right now, what is your monster under the bed in terms of security? Like what keeps you up at night? How could it be remedied? Let's dive in.
The monster under the bed for me, and not to stray too much into fear, uncertainty, and doubt, but it's really just lack of buy-in or awareness in organizations. I still today encounter situations where people are either unaware that security is something worth considering, or they have false assumptions about it. I still hear, oh, we're protected because we're behind a firewall.
Oh, my dude. Yeah.
Lots of organizations have been breached when they had a firewall in place, or I see even outside of work context. I have a friend who in the field, she's got a kid who was joining a youth soccer league and they set up a Discord server. They didn't bother to lock it down. They had a document sharing site of some kind so that they could share like schedules and whatnot, but people were posting information that probably should have been protected, but it was just an open Dropbox kind of folder structure on a website. I was like, whoever set this up was trying to achieve an objective, but they forgot to think through the security implications. And if I walked up to you and handed you a suitcase with $100,000 in it, you would instinctively know how to protect that. You wouldn't just leave it open, sitting out, on the front seat of your car. But if I hand you the login to that system, you don't necessarily think the same thing. So again, not trying to make everybody super paranoid. You don't have to have your tinfoil hat on all the time, but thinking through what the security implications are is really critical. And to bring it back to a business context, I still see people who say, oh, well, we're in the cloud, so Amazon or Microsoft take care of security for me. Not true. Those cloud providers have shared responsibility models. They're responsible for some stuff, visitors to the data center, physical and environmental controls. But if you deploy an application there that doesn't authenticate users, you can still have a data breach even though the cloud service is up and running with no issues. So just that awareness that security is important and buy-in that it's something worth investing in. And I think unfortunately we're also in a really tough spot. Everything ultimately, of course, comes down to return on investment. If you do security well, nothing happens.
Right.
It's anybody's a fan of Futurama. There's a great episode where Bender the robot gets lost in space and encounters an entity that may or may not be a god, and he says, if you do everything right, people won't even know that you've done anything at all. And ultimately, that's what security is like. If we properly secure things, we don't have a data breach, but then it makes it really tough to justify the spending that we put in place. You take the spending away, you have a data breach. We see the cycle. Organizations underspend on security, they have a breach, and all of a sudden, the day after it's announced, there's like 100 job postings on LinkedIn and budget is freed up for all of these resources. Like it would have been cheaper to do that before the breach, but unfortunately, that's a lesson that we just keep seeming to have to learn over and over again.
From your perspective, where does the responsibility lie in those kind of situations? Like, is it on the business leaders to educate themselves on security and kind of like dive in? Because not everyone needs to be a cybersecurity expert, but like who needs to be the bridge there to make sure those priorities are brought forward?
I think ultimately business leaders need to get the right security resources in the room. I think one of the things I learned, eighth grade civics didn't quite cover it, but then as an adult, I was like, I don't think the president can actually do all of this work. It dawned on me that's the purpose of the cabinet. Like those people have a very, very high level of power because there's just so much going on. One person doesn't have all that perspective. So I think a CEO having a CISO, a chief information security officer, or a CSO, chief security officer, who is a true completely empowered member of the C suite, not reporting up to another C level exec, but somebody who is providing that guidance, providing that input, and making sure that the organization is then following through. I think that's one of the most powerful
Yeah.
things. And I still see CISOs reporting up to CTOs where business enablement is the goal of the CTO. They need to put the tech systems in place that support the business. Securing them always comes secondary. It's get things stood up, we'll figure out how to
Right.
secure it later. Ultimately, I think business leaders need to make sure that they're getting that input. They need to seek out those decision makers and then properly empower them. That's budget, seat at the table, and in terms of business process, the CISO needs to be involved at some level with any major business decision. Should we expand to another country? Should we launch a new service? Should we completely set up work from home and disband any office space that we have? Great, might save you a lot of money. We saw this with cloud computing. You can save a ton of money by going to the cloud. You can restructure the way that taxes are collected. That's the one place where my accounting degree does come in handy, OPEX
Fascinating.
versus CapEx. But could we
One of
do
the
that securely? And we saw this with COVID, everybody shifting to remote work, and then the rise of ransomware as things like RDP got hit.
man, it's tough because I want to hear too about, so like let's say that you as a business leader you're like, right, I do need a CISO. You hire someone. Great. That feels like an awesome first step because you're getting an educator and an expert like right, in the midst. But how do you think things like federal things like the safeguards rule or something, like how important is legislation in this conversation too?
I think it's critical because it does provide us with a level. I know the SEC rule that just came out is something that a lot of CISOs are approaching. A lot of lawyers that I know who work in the cyber industry are thinking, okay, what's the definition of materiality? Coming from an accounting background, I know there's a lot of they don't like to do bright line rules because obviously every situation is different, and it's very similar in tech. But at least that provides some guidance. We've seen couple of CISOs, I won't point any fingers, but some of them have been charged where a security incident didn't necessarily get handled correctly, but in the absence of any guidance, I don't know that I can necessarily hold somebody responsible. Definitely think there's a role to play. The one thing that concerns me a little bit, a lot of the lawmakers seem to be a little bit out of touch when it comes to technology.
I hear ya.
No offense to people my parents' generation, but computers were not essential to them. And I look at the things that we do now and I'm like, I don't think that we could go back to a completely paper-based society. So somebody who grew up there may not be able to legislate that appropriately. They definitely need to make sure that we get the right folks. And I love the CISA. I love the folks that they've had in there kind of providing guidance to legislators, finding out what is important, what are emerging trends, and then making recommendations for what kind of rules or enforcement actions should be taken. I think it goes back to the point about getting a CISO on a board. The CEO may not be able to make that decision. They need somebody who can get that information, get them all the context they need to make the decision.
Can I also ask you, like, if you could disseminate one piece of information or one tip, one insight to folks who are growing up with tech in their hands at all time, what you got?
I'm actually facing this with my niece and nephew who are young kids, and yeah, we're struggling with the basics. I had to explain to my niece that there used to be one phone number per household. The idea of one-to-one phone to person matching like doesn't even, so like We got to get over that before I can even start to explain how to secure it.
Totally.
I think the one takeaway, if nothing else, is for them to make sure that they are aware of the value of their data. And again, this comes back to shiny objects, food, shelter. We have thousands, if not millions of years of just instinctive, we know this is a valuable thing to protect. We can't see data. We can't touch it. I can carry around a terabyte on a thumb drive, but it's an $8 thing that I bought in the grocery store, impulse purchase while I was waiting in line. I just picked up a USB drive. It doesn't represent the value. If I put all my identity information on there, it's obviously worth a lot more than $8, but it's really tough to figure that out. So I think remember the value of data and work from there. Is this something that should be better protected? All of that ultimately flows from the value that that data actually has.
I'm also wondering, as a teacher, if you have strategies for creating analogies, because I feel like with kids or with abstract concepts like this, we need kind of more closer to home analogies that we can use. Any insights on that?
This is where being somewhat neurodivergent actually helps, because a lot of times people will say something to me and I have to snap it into a previous frame of reference. So that's always where, when we talk about data sensitivity or data, the value that data brings, I always say, okay, we need to put this into equivalent terms. What is something that's the same value? And that's where I really love organizations that do reports. Many of them are from the marketing departments, but they show like the cost of a data breach. That's a very
Yeah.
large abstract concept. Sometimes looking at past history is helpful there, or looking at, okay, this is the type of business that you're in. Here's an idea of what it would cost you if you had a data breach. That's always been very helpful.
Yeah.
In terms of crafting analogies or finding equivalencies, that's where it really helps to understand where people are coming from. I'll use my niece and nephew again. Their sense of value is pretty small, basic things. For a business, obviously, that's going to be money in an account or something that comes from your financial statement. So figuring out what it is that people is getting very capitalist here, but what it is that they value and how they can measure
Yeah.
that value and being able to point to that is, in terms of framing a risk or framing a problem, always useful. In terms of like being in the classroom and finding an analogy, sometimes that just comes down to being curious and experiencing new and exciting things that are different than what you've previously seen.
Love it.
That comes to a lot of the travel work that I've done. I've done a lot of security audits all over the world where kind of different approaches are common.
Ooh.
Great example, when we were in England, we were doing an audit for a bank. We asked about background checks, and we came on the fairly, from my US perspective, fairly standard question of drug testing. And our English hosts were horrified because privacy laws in most European countries are much stronger. A drug test is considered an invasive medical procedure, so that was a completely different
Mm.
frame of reference. And I realized that, and I've used that as an analogy to say, okay, you're going to roll out multi-factor authentication to an organization. You have people that came from all different backgrounds. For some of them, this is just a bridge too far. You're asking them to do more work than they need to. Understanding that different perspective, highlighting that as a story, that this also comes back to narratives. That's always been a really powerful way for me to build analogies as well.
Can you speak to this concept of narrative? Because I think that as an educator, you're writing the books. That's so cool. You're literally creating the narrative. Like, but how do you learn how to do that? And especially if you're someone who maybe let's say you're someone who isn't going to like write the next book, but you're someone who does want to be able to communicate. Let's say you're a CISO trying to get the story across to the folks at your C-suite level. Like, how can you, as the CISO, create a narrative if you don't have a background in creative writing? Because I think that's the perspective that a lot of people function from, is they think that storytelling is this thing that either you know grandparents or like MFA students do. But
Yeah, I I came by mine just from a love of reading. I come from a family of
Hmm.
educators. The fact that I didn't go into teaching full time as a profession makes me something of an anomaly.
Okay.
I'd say definitely look for opportunities to exercise or even to learn that. I know many people use like Toastmasters, for example, as a way to overcome fear of public speaking or learn how to make a presentation. If you can take something like an adult learning class where you do practice creative writing, you do learn about that. Weirdly, lately I've been getting into a lot of podcasts that are sort of off topic from things that I'm normally interested in. A lot of them are television rewatch podcasts with some of the stars of the shows, many of whom have gone on to do other things like directing or producing. and you're learning a little bit behind the scenes. There was one in particular. I am a Trekkie, so I'll go to this. It was the Star Trek Voyager rewatch podcast. One of the co-hosts is now a director, and he actually talks about how different approaches, different shots, or placement of the camera or sequences not only move the story forward, but also kind of like build the overall feel. And now I'm going back and rewatching. I'm like, oh yeah, I realize low camera. This is something that's telling me, okay, we're probably in a weird space. This isn't somewhere that we normally are. My spidey senses are tingling a little bit, or the camera is tilted. That's usually a bad thing. It means something bad's about to happen. Finding ways to learn about stuff like that, again, it goes back to building analogies. Learning about things outside of what you do on a day-to-day basis has really helped me to figure out, okay, I'm not getting my point across with what I'm saying here. What if I took a different approach? There's nonfiction books that obviously present facts in a very straightforward way. There's fiction where you get the same information, but it's woven through a story and you have details that might feel irrelevant, but if it better connects with your audience, that might actually be something useful.
So I also want to talk, while we still have a little bit of time, about community, because I've been so fortunate to talk to you and to talk to a lot of other experts in this industry, and we have a lot of the same problems, but we also have a lot of the same opinions. Which is a great thing. How have you built community within this industry? Is that important to you? How can people get into it?
I think there are so many different perspectives, and this is why I've handed out more business cards and Ubers of people like, hey, I'm not sure what I want to do. I'm not sure what I want to be. I've taken a couple programming classes, and I'm always like, have you considered security? Take my business card. Let's continue this conversation. I think the biggest challenge, and it comes down to a cliche, but we say security is everybody's responsibility. Ultimately, it really is. Pretty much anybody at an organization has some security responsibility. And if you're not building those bridges, if you don't have a community with different perspectives,
Hmm.
you're going to be missing out on a lot. I actually, a mentor who I really enjoyed working with came from a government background. She was used to the people in her team being in at least a shirt and tie, if not a full suit. And then she went to RSA and she saw these, guys with earrings and long blue hair and crazy beards like mine. And her initial thought was, these people don't fit what I think of as a good cyber expert. And then she attended some of the talks and realized these people are next level. You got to do that kind of reach across. You have to realize, hey, what I'm used to is not necessarily the full scope and breadth of what the security community looks like. In terms of ways to actually do that, I think it'll come down to your personality. I tend to be a little more introverted, so like networking events, mixers, where you have to make small talk and try to meet people doesn't always work for me. So I try to go to things that are specifically focused on security. Actually ended up landing a job one time. I went to a cybersecurity meetup. I was working out in San Francisco for the first time, didn't really have a professional network out there, so literally just went on meetup.com, looked for, I think it was Bay Area cybersecurity professionals.
Love
And
it.
when I was out there for work trips, hopped in there and yeah, we had like meet and greets where there was like a set topic. It was almost like speed dating. They kind of set the topic and there was a little bit more structure there. So it took away that uncomfortable part of figuring out how to introduce myself, how to make small talk, how long do we talk about the weather before we start talking about what we're doing. And yeah, some of the best folks that I've got came out of that. Obviously, lots of virtual networking events exist as well. Those have been kind of my most successful strategies in that, I think.
Yeah, I love that. And I really like actually hearing that, that experience of maybe coming from a really buttoned up background, whether it's in government or some other industry, and you're changing into cyber, and then you go to these conferences and you see people wearing onesies and like wearing, a Chewbacca, whatever they're, it's like we're a chaotic kind of like wonderful group of folks. And I think that it's just really good to hear that like people can maybe experience that shift in perspective too, because this industry really is full of a lot of sort of like unsung heroes, in my opinion, as well. There's like so many people who know so much, and being able to find them is kind of a crucial journey, honestly. Yeah, so great to hear that's been successful for you. Yeah.
And I think if I can just jump on that topic, I think part of why I'm so passionate about not just handing out my business cards to justify having bought them, but so many people think I have to be a programmer or I have to be a network engineer to get into cybersecurity, and that is 100% not true. Most of the big data breaches that we hear about, the underlying cause was a social engineering attack. That doesn't really require a lot of technical skills. That requires psychology. That requires an ability to craft the phishing message that actually got somebody to click on it. So if you have a sociology background, if you have a psych background, if you're a theater major and can think about how to tell a story, how to present something, those are all valid skills that we need in the field. That's one of my personal passions is saying, you don't have technical skills, you absolutely belong in cyber. Come join us.
I completely agree with you. And I will only augment that by saying you also don't have to be a man and you don't have to be white and you don't have to look any kind of certain way. You don't have to be like cyber and the digital world in general actually is, is kind of an equalizer in terms of what the playing field is like. So if you're thinking about it, we need you no matter what.
Yeah, pro tip, whatever you are, look for that thing and add the words in cyber. I guarantee you there's an affinity group. I know there's Blacks in Cyber. A couple of folks who have taken my classes were part of that, so I've jumped on a couple of meetings. I know there are several affinity groups for women in cybersecurity and privacy, I think. There's also one Women in Cyber. There's all kinds of organizations. Literally take your group, add in cyber to it in your preferred search engine, and you'll find your tribe.
So I want to, especially because now I know that you're a Trekkie and maybe more of a nerd than I initially anticipated. Let's say if you could have any superpower to improve, let's keep it pretty broad. Let's say cybersecurity in general, but maybe also maybe to improve like what it's like to be an author, these experiences. What would your superpower be and why?
Oh, so I actually had two, and I think they both apply to cyber as well as to writing. I was going to say either if you're a fan of Dr. Horrible's sing-along video blog, given the medium that we're in here, he had a freeze ray. There always seems to be more work than there's actual time to get it done in the field of cyber. So yeah, being able to stop the world, catch up on all of my Jira tickets, and then restart things. That was there, and it applies to deadlines, which I usually try not to miss by more than 2 or 3 days. When submitting chapters or submitting my tech edits, if that one's not possible, going back again to Futurama, there's a great episode where the main character, I think he hits 100 cups of coffee and he like enters a new state of being where he's moving in super speed. So again, not freezing time, but being able to catch up on everything while the rest of the world kind of crawls by would be nice.
Love it. So efficient, very time oriented, the only limited resource in reality. I love it. Aaron, it's been such a pleasure to have you on here. If people want to find you on the internet, where can you be found?
You can find me on LinkedIn. I think my handle is Aaron CK there. You can also just look for the black and white bearded dude, I always say. There's a couple of Aaron Krauses out there. I do not work in the arts, nor do I work in green tech. Those are two people that have shown up in the past. I'm also on the platform formerly known as Twitter at Great Security, GR, the number 8, and then the word security, although I'm getting less and less active there. So if you follow, happy to follow back, but you may not see me for a couple of weeks at a time.
Okay, wonderful. Well, thank you so much for your time today. We really appreciate it, and we will see you out in cyberspace.